In fact, I think it's a very good thing for young children to be taught a second language when they go to school, to become bilingual. Because I work obviously in the computer industry, and the world's a much smaller place than it used to be. You have a lot of international trade,
Right.
you have technology that crosses international boundaries, and I think it's very good if children in the public schools are taught Chinese, they're taught German, they're taught Spanish, Japanese, other languages. But the way you make a child bilingual who comes from a Spanish language background is for the schools to teach that child
Right,
English.
right.
And right now the schools are not teaching English
Yeah,
to
it
their
seems like
children.
we've had the opposite type of frame of mind on that and understanding.
Exactly.
And, you know, it's interesting too, because I know with having the surname Perez, I did not I didn't grow up in a Spanish-speaking home. My grandparents spoke Spanish, but they also spoke English. But a lot of people just automatically conclude that I speak Spanish, which I now wish I would have learned it.
Sure.
And my son and daughter are learning it in high school. And I see that it would give me the edge. It would have opened more doors for me. But then there's also, like I said, the stereotype of the name Perez and the automatic conclusion that I don't speak English.
Exactly. In fact, one of the most horrifying aspects of bilingual education, the system we have right now, is that there are enormous numbers of children whose first and only language is English, but whose name is Perez or Gonzalez or, Nguyen. And because of their family's name, not because they speak another language, they speak English, but because of their family's name, they are placed in a program where they're not being taught English. In fact, many of the people most enthusiastic about helping our campaign are individuals who might have had some possible support for bilingual education in theory, but when it came down to their children or their grandchildren being placed in a program where they were not being taught English simply because of their family's ethnic background, it really generated outrage in them. And in fact, one of the strong supporters we have is a man named Fernando Vega. He's a lifelong committed Democrat. He's a little bit elderly. He's in his 70s. Very strong conservative Democrat. In fact, he actually was a strong supporter of Bill Clinton in 1992 because he really wanted to put the Democrats back in the White House after all these years. And he, when he was on the local school board in Redwood City, was the one who created the bilingual education program there because he thought it would benefit children. But then as the years went by, he saw it didn't work. And then for him, the final straw was when the school district took his own grandchildren, who don't speak a word of Spanish, and they put them in an all-Spanish language program and refused to let them out simply because their last name was Vega. And once that happened, he became absolutely committed to ending this failed system of bilingual education, has been very supportive of what we're doing. And he's our regional chairman in the San Francisco Peninsula area.
Yeah, so sometimes the purposes vary, or the motive may vary, but the results can be the same, and for the good of all.
Exactly.
That all can benefit.
And one point I'd like to make is I think the people originally tried to put in place bilingual education were very well intentioned. They felt this program would benefit the education of children who had trouble with English, and that it would improve how they were learning English and learning other subjects at the same time. But the problem is it just hasn't worked. And as all of us know, there are many of these large government programs that were set up with the best of intentions 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, and they just don't work today. But there's so many people whose jobs depend on continuing them, and whose funding comes from these programs, that they refuse to admit that the programs have failed.
And for instance, give me a couple examples as to why you think these programs are not working.
Well, the most obvious one is the failure rate. I mean, when you have a system where only 5 or 6% of the children each year successfully learn English, that's a complete disaster. And then when you look, for example, at different ethnic groups in California, of all the immigrant groups in California, the immigrant group most likely to be given the supposed benefit of bilingual education are Latino immigrants. They're put in programs much more than Asian immigrants or European immigrants or any other immigrant group. And then of all the immigrant groups in the state of California, the group that has the lowest test scores and the highest dropout rate and the lowest rate of admission to college are Latino immigrants. So if bilingual education actually were a benefit rather than a harm, it's strange that the group that gets the most of it does the worst. And the reason they're doing so badly is they're not taught how to read and write English. And then suddenly when it comes time for them to take the SAT or to try to apply for college, they have to take the test in English, and they don't know English, and that is a disaster.
Now, when I first began to hear about this initiative, a lot of people were using the term or the phrase English only. Is this correct?
I really would normally not use that
Okay.
phrase. I mean, again, people can call something whatever they want to, but what we're talking about is not having to do with government laws or government documents or street signs or any of that. What
Yeah,
we're
because it
talking-
does sound a little
Exactly.
disrespectful
Exactly.
or rude. You know.
What we're talking about is something much more simple that hopefully all of us can agree on. And that's the idea that when young children start school, they should be taught English as quickly and as effectively as possible.
Yeah.
I'd also like to say that we don't outlaw bilingual education entirely. In other words, those parents who really feel strongly that their children can benefit from a bilingual education program could apply for a waiver, and then they could keep or place their children in bilingual education.
Is this all defined in the initiative?
It's all defined in the
Okay.
initiative. So in other words, it allows parents to apply for a waiver if they want their child in something other than English immersion. But the evidence that English immersion is the best approach to take, and the evidence also is that the overwhelming majority of parents, of immigrant parents, want their children taught English right away. And that's the reason I think they'll be very happy with this initiative.
How long do you think, though, that it would take to implement something like this? I mean, it would probably eventually just represent a small part of the educational system.
It certainly...
How would we work this transition? And you know, what kind of effects would that have?
I don't think the transition is as complicated as most people might think it is, because what would happen once our initiative passes is that the same teachers would be teaching the same children in the same classrooms as before the initiative passed. It's just that they would be teaching them English. And the problem, one of the problems with the current system is that there are 140 different languages spoken in the public schools, and there's an incredible shortage of qualified teachers who speak those 140 different languages.
I can imagine.
Well, on the other hand, having children being taught English is much easier to implement.
You know, I can vouch for that. I've been in stores or utility companies, and a parent maybe or grandparent will bring a 5 or 6 year old child in to be the interpreter.
Exactly.
And I'm thinking, these people, or rather these children, have learned so quickly. Where did they
Exactly.
learn? You know,
In many cases.
and
in
how
fact,
quick they catch on.
Exactly. In fact, just yesterday I was on a Spanish language talk radio show, and I've been on a number of those. And the host was, receiving calls from different individual parents, and most of them really supported what we were doing, most of the Latino parents calling in. And one of them said the thing she was most angry about regarding the bilingual education program, which really is a Spanish-only program,
Right.
to give it its true name, was when her young daughter started school. She'd been in preschool, and the young daughter actually knew English. She knew some English. But because she was in a Spanish language program when she started school, she forgot English over the next couple of years. So she regressed in her knowledge of English because the schools were emphasizing teaching Spanish only rather than teaching these children English.
How real is the fear, though, on the opposite end, that kids will forget Spanish or whatever other language they learned at home?
That's a little bit of a concern, but most of these children are coming from families where their whole family speaks Spanish. And most of the people in their neighborhood speak Spanish, and the parents at home may still watch Spanish TV. Under those circumstances, I don't think the children are going to forget Spanish, but I think they will learn English. And that way they'll know 2 languages rather than 1.
What about the argument or the concern that the language has a lot to do with keeping you tied into your culture, your roots and traditions or what have you?
Well,
What would you say to that?
I think family traditions and family culture and family language are very important, but they are the responsibility of the family. And it's up to each individual family to decide how much or how little of their traditions and culture should be maintained. And that, I think, is very different than the role of the public schools, which have to provide children with the tools they need to become successful, assimilated, productive members of our society. And the most important tool is being able to read English and write English and speak English, because without that, you can't move forward in any other direction.
I see. Ron, I have a question also. What about the people that say that this sounds like an anti-immigrant type of measure or initiative?
That was one of my biggest concerns from the beginning. Now, when I started this initiative campaign, normally with an initiative, the 2 things you're most worried about are being able to get it on the ballot, and once it gets on the ballot, having it win. And from the beginning, I was willing to put in some of my own money to help start the campaign, and I talked with other people, and they were willing to help. And it seemed like a very popular type of issue, so it would be pretty easy to get on the ballot. In fact, we got almost twice the signatures we needed to qualify.
Well, what about the funding, though?
And-
Are people excited about that, too?
Oh, yes, certainly,
Okay.
certainly. And then besides that, you know, once it got on the ballot, I really thought it would certainly be able to win.
Uh-huh.
But the problem I really had from the beginning, and my largest concern, was whether this initiative would be perceived as a unifying or a divisive issue.
Right.
Whether it would be construed as being anti-immigrant or anti-Hispanic or Democrat versus Republican. I was very concerned about that. And, you know, my personal background, I personally come from a very pro-immigrant type of background. My grandparents came to the United States as poor European immigrants. My mother didn't actually grow up speaking any English at home. She learned English when she went to school. And I think we did everything we could during the campaign to make sure it was seen as something that would benefit everybody in the state, the English-speaking population and the immigrant population. And I think that's pretty much the way most people see it. So